I'm Barbara Morrison, 64 years old, and I had spent the better part of Mother's Day getting ready for a dinner I thought my son had planned for me. By late afternoon, my little house was filled with the faint scent of lavender from the perfume I only wore on special occasions. I stood in front of the hallway mirror, smoothing the burgundy dress I'd bought from an outlet shop a week earlier, whispering to my own reflection that it would be a lovely evening. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. When Marcus's SUV rolled into my driveway, my heart lifted the way it used to when he was a boy running home after school. I gathered my purse, locked the door behind me, and stepped out onto the porch with a smile I didn't bother hiding. But the smile faltered the moment the back door opened, and I saw Victoria Sterling step out first. My daughter-in-law's mother radiant, in a pale gold evening gown that shimmered even in the fading daylight. She held a bouquet of lilies close to her chest. The kind of flowers I used to imagine Marcus might bring me someday. "Sweetheart, I'm ready," she told him, adjusting an earring as though a camera crew might be watching. I waited for Marcus to explain, to say something that would close the sudden distance I felt forming between us. Instead, he looked at me with a calm, almost puzzled expression, as if my presence on my own porch surprised him. "Mom," he said, rubbing the back of his neck the way he always did when he knew he disappointed someone. "Did you think this dinner was for you?" The words slipped out of him gently, but they landed on me like a blow. I tried to swallow the sting to steady my voice, but the truth of it pressed down too fast. I watched as Victoria laughed softly, complimenting my dress in a tone that felt more like pity than kindness. Marcus asked if I could open the garage so he could store a few boxes, just for a little while. Then they drove away. 3 of them headed toward the restaurant where I had imagined I would be sitting beside my son. Later that night, long after the sun had slipped behind the trees, Marcus called again. His voice shook. He said he needed $15,000 immediately. And that was the moment everything in me finally shifted. In the quiet that followed Marcus's midnight call, the house felt heavier than it had in years. The next morning, sunlight crept through the kitchen blinds in thin, silent stripes, landing across the table where I sat with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. I kept replaying the night in my head, wondering when exactly I had begun accepting so little from someone I loved so dearly. But I pushed the thoughts aside, telling myself I should start with the realities I could actually touch. And the first reality was that I had built an entire life around a son who barely remembered I existed unless he needed something. In late winter, just a few months before Mother's Day, I had learned again what it felt like to wait for someone who wouldn't come. It had been my birthday, a quiet Tuesday evening. I had roasted a chicken the way Marcus used to beg for when he was 10. Crispy skin brushed with butter and herbs. Potatoes roasted until the edges curled and browned, and a little bundt cake cooling beside the stove. I set the table for 2, smoothing the cloth I kept for special nights. 5 o'clock passed, then 6, then 8. By the time the clock struck 9:30, the chicken had dried out, and the frosting on the cake had formed a thin shell. My phone buzzed once. A short message appeared on the screen. "Mom, I'm so sorry. Work ran late, and Sophia's mom isn't feeling great. Let's celebrate another night. Love you." I stared at the message for a long moment before typing, deleting, and retyping a reply. In the end, I wrote something simple, something that kept me from sounding hurt. Then I sat at the table alone, the echo of the television filling the silence while I ate a dinner made for someone who never arrived. I could have cried, but I didn't. I just felt smaller somehow, like the world had nudged me back into a corner I didn't remember stepping into. A few weeks later, on a cold Saturday morning, Marcus stopped by unannounced. I heard the rumble of his truck before he knocked, and a flicker of hope rose in me the way it always did. He hugged me quickly, already glancing toward the garage. "Mom, I've got some boxes I need to store for a bit," he said. "Storage units are ridiculous these days. It'll just be temporary." I opened the garage for him, watching as he unloaded box after box, old tools, a stack of binders, bags of clothes he didn't wear anymore. They filled the space slowly, but completely until my garage no longer felt like mine. I tried to make a joke, something to hide the sting. "So, I'm cheaper than a storage unit?" He laughed, kissed my cheek, and told me he'd make it up to me eventually. Then he drove off, leaving behind a quiet driveway and a garage crowded with pieces of his life, all of which mattered more to him than the person standing in that doorway. Even now, I'm not sure why that moment settled so deeply inside me. Maybe because it felt like a small rehearsal for the Mother's Day evening that would come later. A moment where I stepped aside willingly so he could place something else above me without hesitation. It wasn't cruelty. It was habit. And I had allowed it for so long that he no longer saw the difference. As spring crept in, nearly everything around me seemed to bloom except the space between me and my son. I kept busy in ways that made the house feel less empty. I joined my neighbor Dorothy for morning walks, leaning on her steady presence as we watched cardinals hop from fence to fence. She often asked whether Marcus had been by or called lately, and I always gave her the gentlest version of the truth. Mothers protect their children's image even when it hurts. Some evenings I try distracting myself by watching old movies, the kind my husband used to love before he passed. But even then, the ache never fully left. It lived somewhere between my ribs, in a place memory and longing had carved out for themselves. I told myself that Marcus was busy, that life pulled adults in different directions, that it wasn't personal. But the more I repeated those thoughts, the hollower they sounded. The night before the infamous Mother's Day call, I remember standing in my quiet kitchen, folding dish towels with more care than they required. A strange heaviness tugged at me, as though the house itself knew something was shifting. I glanced at the garage door, imagining the boxes stacked inside, and felt a tightening in my chest. They were a reminder of a truth I didn't want to face. I was a convenience, not a priority. I didn't know it then. But the slow unraveling of those small moments, birthdays missed, dinners canceled, boxes stored, calls unanswered, would soon collide with the sting of that golden dress evening. And when they did, something inside me would finally stop bending. That realization, still faint and unformed, hovered in the air as part one of the story of my unraveling drew toward its end, quietly setting the stage for everything that would follow. In the weeks leading up to Mother's Day, everything felt strangely hopeful in a way that caught me off guard. It was a Thursday evening when Marcus called. Not a text, not a rushed voicemail, but a full video call. His face filled the screen bright and earnest, as though he had set aside time just for me. The last patch of daylight still glowed behind him. And for a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would tug at my sleeve and ask if we could bake cookies before bedtime. He told me he wanted to do something special this year. He'd heard about a new restaurant, the Copper Finch, a place his coworkers raved about. He said he'd made a reservation for the weekend, and that he wanted me to dress up. Really dress up the way I did when his father used to take me out on anniversaries. I laughed shyly and reminded him I didn't have anywhere fancy to go these days, but he insisted, his smile warm and genuine. After we hung up, I held my phone for a long time, feeling an old familiar warmth settle into me. Maybe things were changing. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. The next morning, I found myself at a small pawn shop on Maple Street, trading in a pair of earrings I hadn't worn in years. With the cash, I bought the burgundy dress that now hung on the back of my bedroom door. I bought a new purse at a discount store, and a pair of low heels that looked elegant enough without making me feel unsteady. When I placed everything on my bed that night, the soft light from the lamp made the dress look richer, almost hopeful. I touched the fabric and whispered, "It's been a long time." Mother's Day morning arrived crisp and bright. I woke early, though I hadn't slept much, and busied myself with dusting shelves, wiping countertops, and refreshing the flowers in the vase on the kitchen table. Dorothy brought over a cherry pie, tapping lightly at my door with her elbow as she carried it in. We sat together on the porch, sipping coffee while cardinals darted across the yard. I told her about the dinner Marcus had planned, trying to sound casual, but she heard the tremor of excitement in my voice anyway. She squeezed my hand and told me it was about time he treated me the way I deserved. As the afternoon stretched on, the house hummed with the soft rhythms of preparation. I laid out my dress, did my hair slowly, carefully, letting the warm air from the dryer fall across my cheeks. When I finally looked at myself in the mirror, I saw someone I hadn't seen in years, someone hopeful, someone who believed she mattered enough to be celebrated. But the moment the SUV stopped in my driveway, that image began to crumble. Victoria stepped out first, radiant in a gown so bright it caught the sun. Sophia followed, smiling politely, and then Marcus, who avoided meeting my eyes at first, as though he were bracing for a misunderstanding he had no intention of correcting. The realization washed over me slowly, painfully. This dinner, the reservation, the restaurant, the gesture had never been meant for me. The lilies Victoria held glowed like small suns in her arms. Marcus's words sank into me with a clarity that left no room for doubt. I felt my throat tighten as though my own home no longer recognized me. When they left, the quiet fell hard. I stood in the driveway long after their car disappeared down the street, the evening breeze lifting the hem of my dress, whispering something that sounded like a warning I had ignored for too long. Inside the house, the air felt strangely hollow. I warmed a frozen meal in the microwave simply because eating nothing would have made the silence unbearable. The television flickered in the living room, casting soft shadows on the walls as I sat alone at the table. I tried not to cry. Tears felt too much like surrender. Instead, I listened to the distant hum of cars passing, the refrigerator clicking on, the house settling around me like a tired old friend. Later, lying on the couch in my dress, I scrolled through social media and saw the picture they'd posted. Marcus, Sophia, and Victoria at the Copper Finch. Victoria was holding the lilies, her smile bright and triumphant. The caption read, "Happy Mother's Day to the woman who means the world to us." It was then, somewhere between the ache in my chest and the slow numbness spreading through my limbs, that I realized something fundamental had shifted. I did not know exactly what form the change would take, but I knew I would not emerge from that night the same woman who had stepped onto the porch hours earlier. Morning arrived with a thin gray light that seeped through my curtains, the kind that makes everything look washed out and softer than it really is. I hadn't changed out of the dress until nearly sunrise, and when I finally slid it off and hung it carefully in my closet, it felt like placing a part of myself into storage. I made coffee out of habit, though the taste barely registered. My hands trembled just enough for me to notice. The night before had left something unsettled in me, something sharp and unfinished. I opened my laptop because I needed to anchor myself in something tangible. Numbers, balances, facts that didn't bend the way emotions did. The screen glowed in the quiet kitchen, and as I logged into my online banking, a strange heaviness settled over my chest. The joint account I shared with Marcus was something I almost never thought about. It had been set up years ago when my husband passed, back when I believed having Marcus listed was simply a safeguard, a way to make my life easier as I got older. But the transactions were there, stark and undeniable. Withdrawals of $400, $850, $2,000, another large one, then more. The total, when I added them up, hovered near $15,000, taken slowly, steadily over the months I'd been waiting for a birthday dinner, for a Mother's Day call, for any sign that I still mattered. For a long moment, I stared at the screen as though the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more forgiving. They didn't. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was a hollow, quiet disbelief, followed by the painful realization that Marcus hadn't just overlooked me. He had used me. I found myself at the bank an hour later, sitting across from a woman with soft gray curls and glasses that rested low on her nose. She walked me through each step gently, explaining my options. Because the account had both our names on it, every withdrawal Marcus made had been perfectly legal. She said it as kindly as she could, but the words still stung. Legal didn't mean right. It didn't mean loving. By the time I signed the papers to close the joint account and transfer the remaining funds into a new one under my name alone, something inside me had settled into a cold, steady resolve. I also asked to revoke Marcus's digital access and deactivate the card he kept tucked in his wallet. When I pressed the final signature onto the form, I felt an unexpected lightness. Not joy, not triumph, but the first breath of freedom I'd taken in a long time. When I returned home, the garage door caught my eye. Behind it, stacked from floor to ceiling, where the boxes Marcus had dropped off without a second thought. I stood there for several minutes, letting the sight of them stir the quiet anger I'd kept pressed down for years. Then I opened the door wide, letting the stale, dusty air spill out into the driveway. One by one, I pulled the boxes out. Some were heavier than others, filled with old textbooks, tools, and gadgets Marcus had collected during phases of his life he'd long forgotten. I dragged each one to the driveway, arranging them neatly under the pale afternoon sun. Dorothy noticed me from across the street and came over without asking questions. She helped me lay a large tarp over the boxes in case of rain, tying the corners with the same practical efficiency she used when covering her garden beds for winter. When we finished, she squeezed my hand and said only, "It was time." I nodded because any words I could have offered would have cracked my voice wide open. That evening, just as the shadows stretched across the yard, my phone began to vibrate. Then it vibrated again and again. Marcus's name flashed across the screen, each call more frantic than the last. I didn't answer at first. I let the silence speak for me. But when the calls didn't stop, I finally picked up. His voice rushed through the line, breathless and panicked. His card wasn't working. The account wouldn't let him in. He was standing in a parking lot after meeting with someone about an investment opportunity, and they were demanding more money, $15,000 immediately. If he didn't pay, he said, he would lose everything he had already put in. His words came in gasps, each sentence sharper and faster than the one before. I listened quietly, my hand resting against the cool surface of the kitchen counter. For years, I had jumped to solve his problems, to soothe, to give whatever I had so he wouldn't feel the discomfort of his own choices. But that night, his desperation didn't wash over me the way it once did. I felt it hit a wall inside me, a wall built from birthday dinners that never happened. Boxes stacked in my garage, lilies held by another woman, and a dress I'd worn for no one. When he finally asked, no, begged for the money, I exhaled slowly. My voice, when it came, surprised even me. It was steady, calm, almost cold. "I can't help you with this, Marcus." There was a long pause, then disbelief, then fury, sharp and loud, spilling through the phone. But I didn't bend. Not this time. Not again. By the time I hung up, my house felt strangely quiet. Not lonely, just still, as though it were waiting to see what version of myself would emerge next. In the days after that phone call, the house felt different in a way I couldn't quite name. It wasn't lighter or happier, but it held a new kind of quiet, the kind that follows a long, shaking breath. I found myself moving through each room slowly, adjusting to the absence of guilt that had lived inside me for so many years. For the first time in a long while, I felt the faint shape of my own life forming again, separate from the needs of a son who had grown accustomed to taking more than he ever gave. Marcus didn't show up for nearly 2 weeks after our conversation. I had expected anger, perhaps even blame. But what came instead was silence, a hollow space where his voice used to be. And strangely, I didn't crumble under it. I cooked small meals for myself, read in the evenings, and took longer walks with Dorothy. When she asked if I was all right, I told her the truth. I didn't know yet, but I was learning to be. One quiet Thursday afternoon, as the sky hung heavy with a threat of rain, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, Marcus stood on the porch, shoulders lowered, his usual confident posture gone. He looked older, worn down by the weight of decisions he could no longer outrun. He held a plain envelope in one hand. "I won't stay long," he said, his voice rough at the edges. I need you to read this." He didn't step inside. He simply placed the envelope on the small table beside the door and walked back to his car without another word. I watched him drive away, a part of me aching and another part relieved that he hadn't pushed for anything more. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. The letter was handwritten, the ink uneven in places where he'd pressed too hard. He apologized, not in the rushed, empty way he sometimes had, but with a depth I hadn't seen from him since he was a boy. He didn't excuse himself or blame stress or opportunity or anyone else. He listed the ways he had hurt me, the birthdays forgotten, the holidays ignored, The money taken without permission. The Mother's Day he had given to someone else. He wrote that hearing me say no had forced him to see the man he'd become, and he wasn't proud of it. By the time I finished reading, tears blurred the final lines. Not because I had been waiting for an apology, but because a part of him, the part one thought I'd lost, was still there. Months passed, and slowly our lives began to find their way back to one another. Not in the old pattern of me giving and him taking, but in small, careful steps. He checked in occasionally. He told me he and Sophia were in counseling, working through the damage caused not only by the scam, but by his own denial. I listened, offering support without surrendering myself the way I once had. When the next Mother's Day approached, I didn't expect anything. I had learned painfully and thoroughly not to tie my worth to that single day. But on the morning of, I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Marcus stood there with a simple bouquet. Daisies, not lilies, and a soft, hopeful expression. "I made a reservation," he said quietly. "Just for us. Only if you want to go." For a moment, I didn't speak. The breeze lifted the edge of my sweater, and in the stillness, I felt something settle into place. Not forgiveness exactly, but a gentle opening, a willingness to see who he might become. "I'd like that," I said. At the restaurant, he let me choose the table by the window. We talked not about the past, not about the wounds still healing, but about the present, the small things that make up a life. When dessert arrived, the server set down 2 forks, and Marcus smiled in a way that reached his eyes. As we walked out into the soft glow of evening, I realized that this finally was the beginning of something honest, not perfect, not rewritten, but real and earned.